QuickBooks Online 2025 lists. Get ready and some coffee because we're learning how to save time with QuickBooks Online 2025. Here we are online in our browser searching for that QuickBooks Online test drive, the free sample company file available to everybody. Looking for the result that has Intuit.com in the URL because Intuit is the owner of QuickBooks. We're going to be choosing the United States version of the software. You can verify that you're not a robot if necessary. I'm going to close the prior tab because it's not necessary any longer. We're in the sample company, Craig's Design and Landscaping Services, opening the major financial statement reports as done every time the report's on the left-hand side. We're then going to be in the standard tab. Within the favorites, right-click in that balance sheet to open the link in a new tab. Right-click in the profit and loss, also opening link in a new tab. Let's tab to the middle. Close up that hamburger, and we're going to change the range 010124 tab 123125 as done, as is our custom. We're going to go down to the years, run it to refresh it. So the year of 2024 and 25 are now side by side. Go into the next side in terms of tabs to the right and closing up the hamburger. Same process on the range, going from 010124 tab 123125, selecting the drop down in years, run it to refresh it, noting there's nothing currently in 2025 except for that $53.99 for some reason, including not having prior presentation transactions included. Why? Because we refreshed the system and opened it in incognito window, so it didn't pull in the cookies, which we recommend you do as well, so we're as close to on the same page as possible. Let's go back to the first tab. We've recently been taking a look at our accounting cycles, which we can think of the accounting cycle in terms of time, such as years, then repeating, quarters, and then months. And we can think of similar processes, those processes generally outlined in the plus button, where we have cash inflows or cash outflows, or you can think about who we deal with. For example, customers, ultimately, hopefully being cash inflow cycle, and it's going to be the sales cycle or revenue cycle. Vendors, that's who we buy stuff from. Cash outflow, ultimately, typically for purchases or expense cycle, and then the payroll cycle for, of course, the employees. However, those cycles really only work once we have the system set up. And if you're starting a new QuickBooks company file or a new company altogether, you first have to set the foundation down before you can build the forms on top of it. Now, we're going to dive into this process a lot more in the second, another course or section where we basically start a new company file from scratch in QuickBooks, and then we're going to add all that foundational stuff. Note that a lot of times if you're a bookkeeper, for example, you might be picking up clients that already have a QuickBooks system set up so that you don't possibly have to do that setup process, although a lot of times you get some messy books that you have to kind of tweak and mess with some of these items, and sometimes it's so messed up that you basically want to start a new company file so that you can basically draw the line and start a new company file from there. And if you're working in a company, so you go and work for a company that uses QuickBooks or possibly any kind of accounting system, they will already have the accounting system set up. What you're typically, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to get in there and learn what has been done in the past, in part using a process like we're doing here, meaning going to the end results like the financial statements, deconstructing, working down to the source documents, seeing how they were created, and then repeating the process so that we have consistency as we deal with transactions going forward in the different cycles, customer, vendor, and employee cycle. But so what we're looking at now is you're only going to deal with these underlying things, which is going to be what I'm calling the lists here, when either there's a problem to the current system, or you're adding a new functionality to a current system, or you're setting up a new QuickBooks file and or a new company as you set up the new QuickBooks file. Now remember, I just want to point out, as a bookkeeper, then you might specialize in these areas. This is another thing that you really want to keep on the radar and say, what kind of clients do I want to be picking up? Some people might specialize in new clients, people switching from a separate accounting system, either not using any online system or possibly a different system, and transferring them into the QuickBooks system. And you're going to be really good at using the lists type items in order to get everything up and running. Or you might be really good at fixing problems. So you're saying, hey, I pick up clients that were a mess before. They've got all these messy lists that are ugly. Their chart of accounts isn't good and whatnot. And I think about whether or not I can fix their system or just start up a new QuickBooks file and transfer that data into possibly the new file in some way, being careful to pull everything in kind of properly. Or you might be working in a system that, hey, I want to have a system that's already set up. I'm really good at the data input, but possibly not so much on the setup process, and possibly work with somebody that needs to get to the underlying foundational items, such as some of these lists. So the general idea would be, once the system is set up, once QuickBooks is up and running, then you're usually just going to be over here and you're going to be doing your normal transactions for whatever type of system that you are in, which could be more or less complex depending on the industry that we are in. And if we have accrual problems, meaning I have to communicate with customers to try to track accounts receivable, I have to communicate with vendors possibly to try to track accounts payable in those cases, or I have payroll, then you're going to go into the centers on the left, sales center, which you might call the customer center, to communicate with customers, and then the expenses center, which you might call the vendor center, to deal with the vendors. And then, of course, the payroll center, if you have payroll within QuickBooks, in order to deal with the payroll items. Back to the dashboard. To set up the foundational items, we can think about those as lists. One way you can get to the lists is in the cog. So in the cog, this is usually where you go, not to set up, but not once the company's running, but normally when you set up the process. So as we saw before, it has some of the company information, our account information, and so on, our users, our customer forms, and so on and so forth. And you'll note that we have here lists. So we have the lists, and they have some of them laid out here, the products, reoccurring transactions, attachments, and so on. But it also has the all lists here. Now, quick terminology note on the lists. If you are in and learning QuickBooks from a book, a textbook, in like a college or something like that, you might not use the term lists in the same way as the software. So this is, I just want to point out, and this is important because whether you are a bookkeeper or whether you work in a CPA firm, you have to kind of know the lingo of normal language to deal with clients and customers, bookkeeping language so that you can talk about the functionality within the system you're using, like QuickBooks, and normal accounting language, which could actually differ, so that we can communicate with people such as possibly the tax preparer and the auditor if we're dealing with those items. So if you're in a textbook situation, you might not have the lists because the lists basically came from the old the old QuickBooks system on the desktop, which was laid out kind of like the old Microsoft Office that had the drop downs up top in a desktop version. And one of the drop downs was lists, right? So they happened to house these things under the drop down of lists. And then from an accounting software system, we started to call them lists. These are all the lists, right? But that term is kind of a QuickBooks term that might be coming in more because of the old desktop software formatting, and might not be something that's as useful for that you're talking to a tax preparer or an auditor, which isn't using the software, but basically is trying to just do the financial statements or taxes, for example. Also note that it's interesting that QuickBooks pulled in that terminology of lists to the QuickBooks Online. That must mean that it was pretty ingrained in people's thoughts, because we don't have the same drop-down system over here anymore. So this could be something that over time you might lose that term because it no longer applies to a drop down of lists, right? But it seems to be still a used term a lot here, so they still have this lists category here. All right, so let's go into the all lists just to take a look at them. Now there's two major lists that we would put under the lists category. That's going to be the chart of accounts, and that's going to be the products and services. These are foundational items for most accounting systems, the most foundational item being the chart of accounts. We'll talk more about the chart of accounts in a future presentation because it's the most important list. But just note that you can find the chart of accounts here under the lists item, but they also currently have it housed under the transactions and then in the chart of accounts. Notice that the chart of accounts, because it's kind of like a behind the scenes thing, it doesn't really fit into like the cycle, sales cycle, expense, or payroll. Kind of fits over here in transactions. Where else would you put it? So the transactions is the bank feeds, used to be called bank feeds, right? But so that's where it's currently at. They might move it somewhere else at some future time, but there is where it is, and it's been under this lists thing for some time as well. Now those are the underlying accounts that we have to set up because these are the accounts that we're going to post to whenever we enter a transaction. So we'll talk a lot more about that later. Getting this chart of accounts correct can save you a lot of time, and you would like to get it correct from the start. Again, this being one of those things where rather than tinkering with it, we would like to get it right from the start, because once you've posted stuff, it's hard to undo the thing. It's right. It's like, if you put too much salt in your food, it's hard to take the salt out of the food, right? If you put too many, if you have accounts that aren't appropriate, it's going to be hard to fix it afterwards. It's a lot easier to fix it beforehand. So that's going to be measure twice, cut once, as opposed to a tinkering system for the most part, although there will be tinkering involved as well. All right, so what else do we have under the lists? Let's go to the cog drop down, lists. We have the products and services. So that also can typically be found under the sales item at this time. They might move it, but if you go into the sales items, you have the products and services. The products and services are the things, goods and services, inventory or services that we sell. So it makes sense that they would be under the customer area, but you can also kind of imagine it under the expense area, because if it's inventory, we also buy inventory. That's why it doesn't uniquely fit anywhere really, which is why it's usually under the kind of like the lists area. But so we'll talk more about these individually, because these are going to be very important as well, although more important in certain types of industries that have to deal with certain things. In other words, if you're in gig work or something and you just get paid by YouTube or something like that, then you might not deal with these products and services at all, because you might just be having a system where you record revenue just with the bank feeds as you get paid by like YouTube or something, or Google, right? But if you sell things within the system, then you're going to want to list out the things that you sell so that you can create the sales forms, which are going to be invoices and the sales receipts. So you need to do that at least. Also, if you deal with sales taxes, these are going to be important for the calculation of the sales tax, which is a consumption tax. So if you're outside of the United States, you have a similar thing with a consumption tax, and then also, so those are going to be the general idea with those. So, and if you have inventory, these will help you, of course, to track the inventory. So we'll talk more about them later on their own, because those are the really important. Let's hit the drop down and let's just touch on the other lists that aren't as important, just to get a quick reference from them. So we've got the reoccurring transactions. Displays a list of transactions that have been saved for reuse. From here, you can schedule transactions to occur either automatically or within reminders. So you might have some transactions that you want to have repeat transactions. And we saw that when we set up our invoices and whatnot, some of them had the option to make the transaction reoccurring. So one example of that might, you might have reoccurring invoices that you might be invoicing somebody on a routine basis, possibly for like a service item that they're paying you for every month or something like that. You might get prepaid, so they might pay you like yearly, and you have to deal with prepayment, and then you're going to record the reduction of possibly the prepayment with an invoice that you can make reoccurring, for example. But the reoccurring transactions will be kind of specialized towards a particular need for a particular type of business. So we're not going to spend a lot of time focusing in on that. We might have another course or section getting more into the reoccurring items. But you can see in here, you've got the reminders. You can set them up to record automatically or possibly have the reminders, and your filtering option here, and transaction types, bill, non-posting, check, and so on and so forth. Let's go back, and then we got the products and services. We'll talk about it later. That's one of the big one. Product categories, a means of classifying items that you sell to customers, provide a way for you to quickly organize what you sell and save time when completing sales transactions. So when we sell products, we can create the categorizations for the products. So in other words, when you're thinking about your things that you are selling, we might have a lists of products and services that we are selling, but we might want to further categorize those products and services into subgroups and so on, to make it a little bit easier to organize if we have a longer lists of products and services. So in here, for example, they have the design, and then the fountains under the designs, landscaping, and so on. You can edit these items and remove these items as well. So I'm going to go back. So we have new categories up top, of course, and there is that one. Let's go back into the cog. Lists and product categories, custom form styles, customize your sales form design, set defaults, and manage multiple templates. Now the customization of the forms, I believe we have another course or section that gets into that. There's two reasons you might want to customize a form. One is because you're providing that form externally to somebody that's dealing with the business, and therefore you want to make it look nice, put your logo on it, and customize it in that way to give it your own look and feel. And two, because you might want to add fields onto the form that help you actually record the transaction and or sort the data once the transaction has been recorded. So you might put like a custom field on the form, which is down here, right? So that you might have more tracking ability within it. So if I go into the custom orders, you have the style. Now these forms, notice invoice, estimate, sales receipt. These top two in particular are the forms that you're more likely to give to clients. Meaning an invoice is when you do work and you bill the client, invoice the client to get paid in the future. Oftentimes the invoice these days being sent electronically. Therefore, that's a form you would want to customize, because it's not just a data input form. It's not just helping you to organize your data input to record the financial transaction, to create the financial statements, balance sheet, income statement, but rather is actually going to be received by somebody, in this case a client, and therefore you want it to look nice. And then we have the estimate form, similarly going to a client. This would happen if we're giving an estimate before we actually invoice. So that's the form that doesn't actually record anything, but like if we have a project that we're going to work on and we want to like mock up how much it's going to cost, or estimate how much it's going to cost, rather than using an invoice, we'll use an estimate, and then we can track the estimate to see whether or not they would want to take on the estimate or not, which means we're most likely going to email the estimate to the client, and therefore once again would like to customize it, possibly making it at least look nice, adding our logo to it, and so on. And then we've got the sales receipt. So if someone's at a cash register, for example, you can imagine that you give them a receipt form, which usually we think of just like a little receipt, But if you're in the QuickBooks system, the receipt form is, the sales receipt is the data input form to record the sale when we receive the payment at the same time, which might be just a data input form. We might not be giving the sales receipt to a client, or sometimes we might print out the sales receipt and give the sales receipt to the client, in which case, once again, we'd like to make it look nice so we can customize it. All right, so then you have so we have another course or section on that. Let's go to the drop down again, back into the lists, and custom fields, custom forms. We've got the custom fields, sort, track, and report information that matters to you, add custom fields. So now we're thinking about make information business decisions with customers. You can add custom fields, which once again might help you with recording specialized types of transactions and tracking specialized types of transactions. So for example, if you want on the invoice a field to track the sales representative that sold the item, there might be multiple ways you can try to do that, right? You might use tags to try to do that, which I have another course or section on. You might use possibly even you might use, the custom fields that you might use like class tracking to try to do something like that as well. So again, these are kind of a special tool that would give you a little bit more customization of the form. So make information-based decisions with custom fields. Custom fields empower you to customize forms to gather meaningful insights, create meaningful and detailed reports to make better business decisions, track, search, and filter data points relevant to your business. So that's going to be specific towards a particular business that has customizable needs. Let's go to the all lists again. And so I think we have another course on some of the customization course or section. And then payment methods, display cash, check, or any other ways you categorize payments you receive from customers. That way, you print deposit slips when you deposit the payment you have received. So payment methods, how are we going to get paid from the customers? We might get paid with cash, check. We've got they have a Diners Club or the credit card. Now this is basically an informational form, and it's having a list here. Oftentimes we might be adding to that list when we collect from a customer. So let me just show you that here. If I hit the plus button, we collect from a customer. If we invoice, we collect when we receive the payment, right? So if I go into the receive payment, we've got this payment method that they could pay us with cash, check, the Diners Club, and so on and so forth. Now this doesn't change the transaction because I'd still be depositing it either into undeposited funds or into the checking account typically, but it's giving us a filter field which will help us to group things together, because note that if they pay us with cash, for example, I'd like to know all the cash payments, because what I'm going to do at the end of the day is take all the cash that I have in the register and deposit it into the bank. So what I want to do is print a report of all the cash transactions that happened, because that should help me to give an internal control over the total cash receipts that I have, which I'm going to deposit into the bank. And then I can take the cash transactions out of undeposited funds, depositing them into the bank so that they will hit the bank feed in one lump sum deposit, right? And then I can do, if I go to the credit card, if I get paid with a credit card, what I want to do is say, well, now I have a third-party institution that's in the middle of me getting paid. So they paid it with a credit card. It's going to go to the credit card financial institution. I want to mark them all off as the credit card payments, so that when the credit card then deposits it into my checking account, I'll be able to group all the ones with the credit card and be able to tie out the grouping of those sales to the amount that got deposited into the checking account, allowing me to move it from undeposited funds into the bank account and tie everything out to have internal control. So remember, the form after this, if it would go into undeposited funds, right here, and then we're going to transfer it into the bank account with a deposit form. And so here we have our deposit forms that help us with that intermediate transaction. And they didn't record the payment method, but it would be nice if they had the payment method, right? If that was cash and that was cash, then I can say, oh, those two were cash, therefore these two should add up to the deposit that I make at the end of the night. If these two were the credit card, then I should say, okay, when the credit card company deposits money into my account, I should be able to look at these payments in some way and tie them together to the amount that got deposited into my account. Also, in that case, possibly having to deal with a charge that they charged me as well. Now, the other form that you're going to have that with, cancel, do you want to leave without saving, is with the sales receipt form. Sales receipt form, because then we get paid at the same time. Payment methods, same payment methods. So those payment methods are going to create this list over here in the all lists on the payment methods. Then we have the terms. Display the list of terms that determine the due dates for payments from customers or payments to vendors. Terms can also specify discounts for early payment. From here, you can add or edit terms. So if I go into the terms, most likely the most important terms are in the type of business where you do the work first and then invoice the client. Because if you invoice the client, you want to determine how long you expect payment. So a standard payment method might be 30 days. So if I bill them today, I expect to be paid within 30 days. I gave you the invoice today, I'm giving you 30 days to pay me. And that's going to be important because that term will then tell me when the invoice is due, and that will help me to track if it's past due to follow up to receive payment on it. Now, you might try to charge fees and whatnot if for late payments and whatnot, which can also be based on these terms. I think we have another course or section that gets into that in a little bit more detail. Now, the terms can also be on the bills that we get from vendors, but they're not going to be as useful there because the terms are going to be dictated typically by the vendor. By the time we get the bill, we're just going to have to enter the end date. So let me just show you what I mean on an invoice. If we go to an invoice, we have seen that the terms are right here. You could add the terms as we go, but if it's net 30, I'm going to send out the invoice. It's today's the 21st. I'm going to have a net 30. That means that the due date is 2/20. That due date's important because that's what I'm going to track my accounts receivable by and try to organize and collect on the payment based on that, which we would do down here in the sales area, tracking the receivable. Now, on the bill side of things, if I was to enter a bill, that means that we're going to pay the vendor at some future point. And I also could enter terms here, but that's not as useful because if I have the bill, I'm kind of at the mercy of the person I'm paying. I'm just going to enter the due date oftentimes that's on the bill. So whatever the bill says is the due date. I'm probably going to have to manually put that in unless I'm getting the bill like at the same time it was issued electronically and I know what the terms are, then I can automate that. So that's going to be those, and let's close that out. Do you want to leave it? Yeah, leave without saving. Hit the drop down again. Lists. So terms, attachments, display the list of all attachments uploaded. From here, you can add, edit, download, and export your attachments. You can also see all transactions linked to a particular attachment. So we have our attachments. No attachments are currently in here, but the attachments could be useful when we saw some of our forms that you might want an attachment to it. So one common example would be, what if you, like a lot of times when we buy things these days, we don't have to deal with the sales, like the receipts like we used to. In other words, before we had electronic transfers driving most transactions, we had cash transactions. And if you bought something with cash, then you needed the receipt because if you were audited, say, by the IRS and you took a deduction for an expense, they're going to want evidence, and just seeing a decrease to the checking account without having any indication on who you paid wasn't good enough, right? So you have to give them a receipt, and then we have to upload all the receipts and this kind of stuff. These days, most people don't deal with cash as much, which has its pros and cons. If we can get our clients and ourselves doing electronic transfers, then we don't need to do as many attachments. We don't need to add all these receipts into our system, most likely, or less likely to need to do that, because we have the record not only that cash came out of our accounts, but who we paid it to. So it's a little bit more transparent that way. But even under that system, you can still imagine when you would want attachments. For example, if you bought equipment. If you bought equipment and you bought like 5 computers or something like that, then you might want to attach the invoice of the 5 computers, because you're not just going to record it as an expense, you're going to record it as an asset. And you maybe want to give this information to your tax preparer, so when they put it on the books on the depreciation schedule, they don't put it on as one lump sum purchase of equipment, because when they do that, you won't be able to sell one of the computers or dispose of one computer. It'll become a problem in the future. So one way you could use the attachments that I would think is quite relevant is anytime you buy equipment, you make sure to take the sales document and possibly financing terms, so that at the end of the year, the tax preparer can properly put the breakout of the 5 computers, the numbers of the computers, if there's identification numbers, serial numbers, so that you can identify each of the computers, so that when you dispose of them later, you won't have a big mess and a big problem, and possibly give them any financing information, so that they can also then create possibly the amortization schedules, break out the interest payment portions, and possibly break out short-term and long-term payments of any loans, as well as deal with any trade-ins or anything like that. So that would be useful. So how would you do that? One way, usually if you go into, like, you make a purchase with an expense form, for example, you have down here add attachments, right? So now we can add the attachment, which is going to be in the list of attachments, and it will also be linked to this particular form. And if this form was used to create the financial statements in the assets list, fixed assets, then if you give this information to your accountant, sharing it with the accountant view, they can drill down on the increases to the property, plants, and equipment, and possibly pull the appropriate reports, giving them the more information necessary to make their depreciation schedules. Let's see what else we got. Okay, let's close this out. Let's go into the plus button. Almost there. We have tags. Display the list of all tags created. You can add, edit, and delete your tags here. So the tags are a cool type of tracking tool. So we have a whole other course or section on tags, but the general idea is that you might want to give more sorting data into your reports, tracking different items within your reports. And you could use class tracking to do that. You could use location tracking to do that. And you could use tags to do that. And you can basically think of these as giving you usually like an income statement that would be breaking out columns. So if I go to the income statement, you can think of, instead of breaking out this year by year, I can think of different columns per tag. So possibly I have a tag for sales reps or something like that. And maybe it can break out a column that has been transactions in it that have been tagged for sales reps, and so on and so forth. Now there's some differences between when you might use tags versus location tracking versus class tracking. So all those options are really, and projects is another one, that all of those things are super cool things and specialized items, but they also get a little bit confusing because there's some overlap in terms of how you can use them functionality wise. So you want to think about, if you want to break these things out and track some things like with tags, you want to just make sure you think about, well, would it be better for me to use class tracking? Do I have class tracking versus tags based on the level of software that I'm using? Meaning you might have to pay more for some functionality such as class tracking, for example, but if you're using it, it might be worth it, and so on and so forth. So that gives you some more tracking. We have, again, a whole nother course or section on it, which these things are usually going over and above simply just tracking for, creation of the financial statements. In other words, you don't need tags for normal double entry accounting system data input. It would be for more specialized tracking customization.